The November wind cut through Marcus Rivera's worn jacket like a blade as he walked the empty parking lot of Billings Mall. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid Montana air, and his right hand trembled slightly, a constant reminder of the IED blast that changed everything 7 years ago. At 45, Marcus looked older than his years, his dark hair streaked with premature grey and deep lines etched around his brown eyes. The security guard uniform hung loosely on his frame. Once he'd been a solid 180 pounds of muscle and determination. Now barely 155 pounds, he moved through his rounds like a ghost haunting familiar territory. The mall closed at 9, but Marcus's shift continued until dawn, watching over empty stores and dim corridors that echoed his footsteps. Another quiet night, he muttered to himself, a habit he'd developed during the lonely hours. Talking helped keep the darker thoughts at bay, though sometimes even his own voice couldn't drown out the memories. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister Elena in Missoula. "Still coming for Thanksgiving? Mom's making your favorite tamales." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Maybe. Work's been busy." It was a lie. Work was never busy, and they both knew his excuses were wearing thin. Inside the security office, Marcus settled into his chair and pulled out a thermos of coffee. The local news played on the small television, the anchor's voice filling the silence. A story about the Montana National Guard caught his attention, something about budget cuts threatening to close several smaller units, including the one right here in Billings. Staff Sergeant Thompson says they're fighting to keep the 163rd Engineering Company operational, the reporter explained. With declining enrollment and limited resources, many rural units face an uncertain future. Marcus recognized the name. Jake Thompson had been a few years behind him in high school, a good kid who'd joined the Guard straight after graduation. Unlike Marcus, who'd gone active duty and seen 3 tours in Iraq, Jake had stayed local, balancing civilian life with monthly drills and annual training. The camera showed young soldiers in training, their faces serious but untested. Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest, not entirely nostalgia but something deeper. These kids reminded him of his first unit, before the war changed everything, before the nightmares and the shaking hands and the inability to hold down a real job. A car backfired in the distance, and Marcus's body went rigid. His heart raced as his mind transported him back to a dusty street in Fallujah, the smell of burning fuel and cordite filling his nostrils. He gripped the desk edge until his knuckles went white, breathing slowly through his nose until the episode passed. "You're okay," he whispered to himself. "You're in Montana. You're safe." But safe felt like a relative term these days. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, dusting the streets of Billings with a thin white layer. Marcus sat in Rosie's diner, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. The waitress, a kind woman named Beth, who'd known him since high school, refilled his cup without being asked. "You eating any of that, Marcus? Or just rearranging it?" she asked with a gentle smile. "Sorry, Beth. Just thinking." "About anything in particular?" Before Marcus could answer, the bell above the door chimed, and Jake Thompson walked in, still wearing his ACU uniform from morning PT. His blonde hair was regulation short, and despite being in his early 30s, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never seen real combat. Jake spotted Marcus immediately and walked over. "Marcus Rivera? Damn, it's been forever." "Hey, Jake." Marcus half stood to shake hands, noting how Jake's grip was firm and his eyes clear, unmarked by the shadows that Marcus carried. "Mind if I sit? I was just grabbing breakfast before heading to the armory." Marcus gestured to the empty chair across from him. Jake ordered coffee and a full breakfast, the appetite of a man who slept soundly at night. "I heard you were back in town," Jake said. "Been meaning to look you up. How are you adjusting to civilian life?" The question everyone asked, as if there was a simple answer. "Getting by. Working security at the mall." Jake nodded, and Marcus appreciated that he didn't offer empty platitudes about things getting better or finding his way. Too many people had tried that approach. "Actually, I'm glad I ran into you," Jake continued. "We've got a situation with the unit. Budget cuts have us on the chopping block, and we need to prove our value to keep the doors open. We're entered in a state competition next month. Marksmanship, tactical exercises, team challenges. The problem is we're down several qualified shooters, and most of my guys are young, fresh out of basic." Marcus said nothing, but something stirred in his chest. I know it's been a while since you held a rifle, but your record speaks for itself. 3 combat tours, expert marksman, distinguished service. We could use someone with your experience, even if it's just for training advice. I don't think that's a good idea, Jake. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Jake noticed but pressed on. Look, I know you've been through hell, but these kids need to see what real soldiering looks like. You don't have to make any commitments. Just come to a few training sessions. If nothing else, maybe it'll give you something to do besides walk around that empty mall all night. Marcus stared out the window at the falling snow. Part of him wanted to say yes, to feel useful again, to remember what it was like to be good at something. But another part, the part that woke him up screaming some nights, whispered warnings about triggers and memories and the weight of expectations he might not be able to meet. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Jake smiled and pulled out a business card. "Training starts this Saturday at 800. We drill at the Armory on 2nd Street. No pressure, but Marcus, these kids could learn a lot from you." After Jake left, Marcus sat alone with his cold coffee and cooling eggs, the business card feeling heavier than it should in his pocket. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the familiar streets of his hometown in a blanket of white, making everything look clean and new, at least from a distance. Saturday morning arrived grey and cold, with a bitter wind that cut across the empty parking lot of the National Guard Armory. Marcus sat in his old Ford pickup for 10 minutes, engine running, heater blasting, watching soldiers half his age file through the metal doors. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the black plastic. 3 times he'd started to put the truck in reverse. 3 times something had stopped him. Finally he turned off the engine and stepped into the cold. The armory smelled exactly as he remembered: gun oil, canvas, and the faint metallic tang of weapons that had seen use. The familiar scent hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories, both bitter and sweet. "Rivera, you actually showed up." Jake's voice boomed across the motor pool. He approached with a genuine smile, wearing full battle dress uniform. "Wasn't sure you'd take me up on it." "Neither was I," Marcus admitted, zipping his civilian jacket tighter. Among the uniformed soldiers, he felt exposed, out of place. Jake led him toward a group of about 15 soldiers gathered around a map table. They ranged in age from barely 18 to mid-20s, their faces unmarked by the kind of experience that left permanent shadows. As Marcus approached, conversations died, replaced by curious stares and barely concealed whispers. "Listen up," Jake announced. "This is Marcus Rivera, former Staff Sergeant, 1st Infantry Division. 3 combat tours, expert marksman, and more field experience than most of us will ever see. He's volunteered to help with our training." A young specialist named Collins, Marcus could see his name tape, raised his hand slightly. "With respect, Sergeant Thompson, isn't he a little old for active training?" Some of the soldiers snickered, and Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. At 45, he was indeed older than anyone else in the group by at least 15 years. His graying hair and the slight tremor in his right hand didn't help his case. "Age and experience aren't the same thing, Collins," Jake said firmly, "but you'll figure that out soon enough." Another soldier, Private First Class Williams, couldn't resist adding, "My dad says guys who couldn't hack it in the real world end up working mall security." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Marcus felt every eye on him, waiting for his reaction. The old Marcus, the soldier who'd led men through firefights in Fallujah, would have had words for Williams, but that man felt like someone from another lifetime. "Williams," Jake's voice carried warning. "That's enough." "It's okay," Marcus said quietly. "He's not wrong. I couldn't hack it in the real world." The admission came easier than he'd expected. "Lost my job at the construction company, couldn't focus. Sleeping's been rough. So yeah, I work security at the mall because it's quiet and nobody shoots at me." The group fell silent, some looking uncomfortable at his honesty. "But I can still shoot," Marcus continued, meeting Williams's eyes. "Question is whether you can." Jake clapped his hands once. "All right, enough chatter. We've got 4 weeks to get ready for the state competition. First event is individual marksmanship, then team tactical scenarios. Rivera's here to observe today, maybe offer some pointers." The group moved to the weapons storage, where Jake issued M4 rifles and ammunition. Marcus watched the soldiers handle their weapons, some with confidence, others with the careful uncertainty of people still learning. Their movements were technically correct, but lacked the fluid efficiency that came only from necessity. The outdoor firing range lay 20 minutes from the armory, a stretch of open ground with target stands at various distances. The wind had picked up, and Marcus automatically gauged its speed and direction, old habits that apparently never died. The soldiers spread out along the firing line, settling into prone positions with varying degrees of comfort. Marcus stood behind them with Jake, observing as they sighted their weapons and prepared to fire. "Standard qualification course," Jake explained. 40 rounds at distances from 50 to 300 meters. They need to score at least 23 out of 40 to pass. The first relay began firing, and Marcus watched their form critically. Most were decent shots, but he could see small inefficiencies, improper breathing, inconsistent sight pictures, inadequate compensation for wind. Their shots clustered reasonably well, but reasonable wouldn't win competitions. "Not bad," he murmured to Jake, "but they're fighting their weapons instead of working with them." Collins finished his string with a score of 28. Respectable, but nothing spectacular. Williams managed only 22, just under the passing threshold. As the young soldier stood up, clearly frustrated, he noticed Marcus watching. "I suppose you could do better, old man," Williams called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The range fell quiet, except for the wind whistling through the target frames. Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something he hadn't felt in years. Challenge. Purpose. "Williams," Jake warned, but Marcus held up a hand. "It's been 7 years since I fired a rifle," Marcus said, walking slowly toward the firing line. "These hands shake sometimes, and I haven't exactly been keeping in practice." He knelt beside one of the weapons, an M4 identical to the ones he'd carried in Iraq. The rifle felt foreign at first, heavier than he remembered, but as he settled into position, something shifted. His body remembered, the angle of the stock against his shoulder, the placement of his cheek on the weapon, the sight alignment that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. "Spotter?" he asked quietly. Jake moved up beside him with binoculars. "Winds about 8 knots left to right, targets at 200 meters. Marcus controlled his breathing, feeling his heart rate slow. The tremor in his hands, ever present for 7 years, simply stopped. Not through effort or willpower, but as if his body remembered a state of being it had forgotten it could achieve. The first shot broke clean, and Jake called out, "Center mass, high!" Marcus made a minute adjustment and fired again. "Dead center!" By the 5th shot, a crowd had gathered. By the 10th, even the soldiers who'd been packing their gear had stopped to watch. Marcus fired with mechanical precision, each shot flowing into the next with the rhythm of someone who'd done this thousands of times under conditions far more stressful than a Montana firing range. When he'd fired 20 rounds, Jake lowered his binoculars with something approaching awe. Perfect score. 20 out of 20 in the 10 ring. Marcus stood slowly, his legs stiff from the prone position. The tremor had returned to his hands, but something else had changed too. For the first time in 7 years, he felt like himself again. Not completely, but enough to remember who he used to be. Williams stared at the target through his own binoculars, his earlier cockiness replaced by stunned silence. Collins whistled low and shook his head. "Jesus, Sergeant Rivera, where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Marcus handed the rifle back to Jake, the weight of everyone's attention settling on him. "Fallujah," he said simply. "When missing meant your friends didn't come home." The range remained quiet as they packed up their equipment, but the silence felt different now, respectful rather than dismissive. As they loaded into vehicles for the ride back to the armory, Marcus caught Williams's eye. "Still think I'm just some washed-up mall cop?" Marcus asked without malice. Williams shook his head, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "No, sir. I think we could learn a lot from you." Marcus nodded and climbed into Jake's Humvee. Through the window, he watched the Montana landscape roll past, familiar territory that suddenly felt less empty than it had that morning. The week following the range session brought an unexpected change to Marcus's routine. Instead of dreading the long, empty hours at the mall, he found himself thinking about the soldiers, their eager faces after witnessing his shooting demonstration, the questions they'd peppered him with during the ride back to the armory. Wednesday evening, as Marcus made his rounds through the deserted shopping center, his phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Training Thursday night, 1900 hours. Indoor tactics. Could use your input on room clearing procedures." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment. Room clearing, something he'd done countless times in Iraq, moving through buildings that might contain enemy fighters, improvised explosive devices, or terrified civilians. The memories weren't all pleasant, but they were real and they were his. He typed back, "I'll be there." Thursday night found him back at the armory, this time arriving early enough to help Jake set up. They'd converted part of the motor pool into a mock building, using plywood walls and cardboard barriers, creating a maze of rooms and corridors that simulated urban combat conditions. "Most of these kids have never cleared a room outside of basic training," Jake explained as they positioned targets and obstacles. "The competition includes a tactical scenario, hostage rescue simulation, teams of 4, live ammunition, time limits." Marcus nodded, studying the layout with a tactical eye. "What's their experience level?" "Mixed. Collins has been to a few schools, shows promise. Williams is eager but reckless. The rest are pretty green." Jake paused. "Honestly, Marcus, without someone who's actually done this for real, we're probably going to embarrass ourselves." The soldiers arrived in groups, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Even Williams approached Marcus directly, his attitude completely changed from the previous week. "Sergeant Rivera," he said formally, "I wanted to apologize for what I said last Saturday. That was out of line." Marcus appreciated the apology but waved it off. "Forget it, Williams. You didn't know. But now you do, so let's focus on making you better." Jake called the group to attention and outlined the evening's training. "Tonight we're working close-quarters battle, real-world application of room-clearing techniques. Sergeant Rivera has extensive experience in urban combat and will be walking us through proper procedures." Marcus found himself standing in front of 15 expectant faces, many of them younger than some of the soldiers he'd led in Iraq. For a moment, the weight of their attention felt overwhelming. Then he looked at Collins, saw the genuine eagerness to learn, and something clicked into place. "Room clearing isn't about being a hero," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of hard-earned experience. "It's about staying alive and bringing your teammates home. Every movement has to be deliberate, coordinated, and based on trust." He walked them through the basics, proper positioning, angles of fire, communication protocols. What impressed him was how quickly they absorbed the information, their questions intelligent and focused. "Sir," Collins raised his hand, "in your experience, what's the biggest mistake people make?" Marcus considered the question. "Going too fast. Adrenaline makes you want to rush, but speed without precision gets people killed. Smooth is fast, fast is smooth, but smooth comes first." They ran the first few drills slowly, Marcus correcting positioning and timing. Williams, despite his earlier attitude, showed natural instincts for the work. Collins demonstrated leadership potential, coordinating his team's movements with growing confidence. By the third drill, the soldiers were moving with increased confidence, their movements more fluid and coordinated. Marcus watched from the sidelines, offering corrections and encouragement as they navigated the mock building. "Collins, your sector coverage is improving, but watch your spacing with Williams," Marcus called out as the four-man team prepared for another run. "Remember, you're responsible for your teammates' blind spots." The drill went smoothly until they reached the final room, a hostage rescue scenario with multiple targets and one friendly. Williams, leading the entry, hesitated at the doorway, his rifle wavering between two targets. "Take the shot," Collins whispered urgently. "I can't tell which one's the hostage," Williams replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Marcus stepped forward. "Time out." He approached Williams, who was clearly frustrated with himself. "What are you seeing in there?" "Two figures behind cover, one standing, one kneeling. The lighting's bad, and I can't make out which target is which." "Good. You're not rushing the decision." Marcus moved beside him. "In Iraq, we called this the 2-second rule. Better to take 2 extra seconds to identify your target than to live with the wrong choice forever." He pointed to subtle differences in the silhouettes. The standing figure's positioning suggested hands raised in surrender, while the kneeling figure's posture indicated someone holding a weapon. "Sometimes the difference between a combatant and a civilian is just body language," Marcus explained. "Trust your instincts but verify when possible." Williams nodded and re-entered the scenario. This time, his shots were precise and confident, eliminating the threat while preserving the hostage. As they broke down the training setup, Collins approached Marcus. "Can I ask you something personal, Sergeant?" Marcus looked up from coiling rope. "Shoot. Jake mentioned you have some challenges from your service. PTSD, right?" Collins's voice was respectful, curious rather than pitying. How do you deal with it? The question caught Marcus off guard. In civilian life, people either avoided the topic entirely or treated it like a contagious disease. Here was a young soldier asking honestly about something that might affect his own future. Some days better than others, Marcus answered truthfully. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way certain sounds or smells can transport you back. It's real, and it doesn't just go away. Does it ever get better? Marcus considered the question as he watched Williams helping other soldiers clean their weapons. I thought it was about forgetting, about moving past what happened. But maybe it's more about finding new purpose, new ways to use what you learned. He gestured toward the soldiers. This week, training with you guys, I've slept better than I have in months. Collins nodded thoughtfully. My cousin did 2 tours in Afghanistan. He says the hardest part wasn't the war, it was coming home to people who couldn't understand. Your cousin's smart, Marcus replied. The civilian world doesn't know what to do with us sometimes. But places like this, he indicated the armory, they get it. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Jake pulled Marcus aside. I've got to say, Marcus, you're a natural instructor. These kids have improved more in 2 sessions than they did in the previous 2 months. Marcus felt something warm in his chest. Pride, maybe, or just the satisfaction of being useful again. They're good soldiers, Jake. They just needed someone to show them they already had what it takes. The state competition is 3 weeks away, Jake continued. I know you didn't sign up for this long term, but would you consider staying on through the competition? We could really use your experience. Marcus looked around the armory, at the cleaned weapons, the neat rows of equipment, the lingering smell of gun oil and determination. For the first time in 7 years, he was somewhere he belonged. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll stay. Outside, the November wind had died down, and the first stars were becoming visible through the Montana sky. As Marcus walked to his truck, he heard Williams call out behind him. See you next week, Sergeant Rivera. Marcus raised a hand in acknowledgement and climbed into his pickup. The drive home felt different somehow, less like an ending and more like a beginning. 2 weeks before the state competition, Marcus arrived at the armory to find Jake pacing outside the building, his usually calm demeanor replaced by visible stress. Snow had begun falling again, coating the parking lot in a fresh layer of white that crunched under Marcus's boots. What's wrong? Marcus asked, noting the tension in Jake's shoulders. We just got word about the competition format, Jake replied, holding up a folder of papers. It's not just marksmanship and basic tactics anymore. They've added a stress scenario, live fire exercise with time constraints, multiple objectives, and evaluation by active duty special forces instructors. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. What kind of stress scenario? Simulated forward operating base under attack. Teams have to coordinate defensive positions, conduct counterattacks, and execute casualty evacuation procedures, all while being evaluated on leadership, decision-making under pressure, and tactical proficiency. Jake ran a hand through his hair. Marcus, these kids have never been in anything remotely like combat conditions. Inside the armory, the soldiers were already gathered, their usual pre-training chatter subdued. Word had clearly gotten around about the new requirements, and the weight of expectation hung heavy in the air. Collins approached them immediately. Sergeant Thompson, is it true about the competition changes? It's true, Jake confirmed. We've got 2 weeks to prepare for something significantly more challenging than we anticipated. Williams, who had grown more confident over the past weeks, looked genuinely worried. Sir, most of us have never been in a real firefight. How are we supposed to perform under that kind of pressure? Marcus studied the group of young faces, seeing his own anxiety reflected in their expressions. These soldiers had trusted him to prepare them, had looked to him as someone who knew what real combat felt like. Now they needed more than just technical instruction. They needed someone who could teach them how to function when everything went wrong. The good news, Marcus said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt, is that pressure is just another variable to account for, like wind speed or target distance. You can learn to work with it instead of against it. He moved to the center of the group. Tonight we're going to find out what you're really made of. Jake, kill the main lights. Use emergency lighting only. As the armory dimmed to the red glow of emergency bulbs, Marcus began setting up a scenario more intense than anything they'd attempted before. Collins, Williams, Rodriguez, and Martinez, your team 1. Your mission: defend this position against multiple attackers, while coordinating with Team 2 for ammunition resupply and casualty evacuation. He pointed to a makeshift defensive position he'd constructed from sandbags and barriers. "What about the rest of us?" asked Private Chen, a quiet soldier who had shown steady improvement over the past weeks. "You're the attacking force. Your job is to make this as realistic and challenging as possible for the defenders." Marcus handed out blank ammunition and training weapons. "No one gets hurt, but I want this loud, chaotic, and as close to combat conditions as we can safely simulate." Jake looked uncertain. "Marcus, are you sure about this? If someone gets injured..." "Jake, in 2 weeks these soldiers will be evaluated by people who've been in actual firefights. They need to know what it feels like when their heart rate spikes, when they can't hear orders over gunfire, when they have to make split-second decisions while everything around them is falling apart." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling his own pulse quicken with the familiar pre-combat anxiety he hadn't experienced in years. "Trust me on this." The exercise began with Marcus triggering a loud recorded explosion through the armory's PA system. Emergency sirens wailed as the attacking force opened fire with blanks from multiple directions, the sound echoing off the concrete walls in a deafening cacophony. Collins, designated as team leader, immediately took charge. "Williams, left flank. Rodriguez, covering fire. Martinez, get on the radio for support." But the noise was overwhelming. Williams couldn't hear Collins's orders and moved to the wrong position, creating a gap in their defensive line. Rodriguez, rattled by the chaos, struggled to maintain aimed fire. Within minutes, the carefully practiced procedures began breaking down. Marcus watched from the sidelines, his own body responding to the simulated combat with unwelcome familiarity. His hands began to shake, not from his usual tremor but from the adrenaline coursing through his system. The sound of gunfire, even blanks, triggered memories he'd worked hard to suppress. "Contact left," Chen shouted from the attacking force, adding realistic battlefield communication to the chaos. Collins tried to regain control of his team, but his voice was lost in the din. Williams, frustrated by the confusion, made a critical error, breaking from cover to attempt a flanking maneuver without coordination. In a real firefight, it would have been fatal. Marcus called a halt to the exercise. "Cease fire, everyone freeze where you are." The sudden silence was jarring after the sustained noise. Soldiers remained in their positions, breathing hard, some visibly shaken by the intensity of the simulation. "What just happened?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the post-adrenaline quiet. "We got our asses handed to us," Williams admitted, his earlier confidence deflated. "Collins, talk to me. What went wrong with your team coordination?" Collins looked frustrated with himself. "I couldn't make myself heard over the gunfire. When I tried to shout louder, it just added to the confusion." Rodriguez: "I panicked, Sergeant. The noise, the chaos. I couldn't focus on my target acquisition. My shots were all over the place." Marcus nodded, recognizing the honest self-assessment. "Good. You're identifying the problems. That's the first step towards solving them." He moved to where the team had been positioned. "In Iraq, we had a saying, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, but first you have to know what smooth looks like." He began walking them through what had gone wrong: communication breakdown, loss of fire discipline, failure to maintain positional awareness. But more importantly, he explained why these failures were normal and how to overcome them. "Your heart rate probably hit 150 beats per minute in there," he told them. "That's when fine motor skills start to break down, when your hearing gets compromised by adrenaline, when your vision starts to tunnel. These aren't weaknesses. They're normal physiological responses to stress." Williams raised his hand. "So how do you function when that happens?" Marcus considered the question, remembering his own learning curve in Iraq, the mistakes that had nearly cost lives, the gradual development of instincts that had kept him and his soldiers alive. "You practice until the right responses become automatic. You develop simple, clear communication protocols that work even when you can't think straight. And you learn to trust your training and your teammates, even when everything feels like it's falling apart." Jake stepped forward. "Marcus is right. What you just experienced, that's what combat stress feels like. Now that you know what you're dealing with, we can train you to handle it." Marcus looked around at the group of soldiers, seeing past their current frustration to their potential. "We're going to run this exercise every night for the next 2 weeks. It's going to be loud, chaotic, and uncomfortable. By the time we're done, you'll be able to function under pressure because pressure won't be new to you anymore." Collins straightened his shoulders. When do we start again? Right now, Marcus replied. Reset your positions. This time, we're going to focus on communication protocols that work when you can't hear yourself think. As the soldiers moved back to their starting positions, Marcus caught Jake's eye. His friend looked concerned, clearly recognizing the toll the exercise was taking on Marcus himself. You okay? Jake asked quietly. Marcus nodded, though his hands were still trembling slightly. I will be. These kids need this, Jake. They need to know they can handle whatever gets thrown at them. Even if it costs you. Marcus looked at the soldiers preparing for another round of simulated combat, their faces determined despite their earlier struggles, especially then. 1 week before the competition, Marcus arrived at the armory to find Collins sitting alone on the front steps, still in his civilian clothes despite training being scheduled to start in 20 minutes. The young soldier's head was in his hands, and his shoulders shook with barely contained emotion. Marcus approached carefully, recognizing the signs of someone pushed beyond their comfort zone. He'd seen it before in Iraq. Good soldiers who hit their breaking point not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility they'd placed on themselves. Collins? Marcus sat down beside him on the cold concrete steps. What's going on? Collins looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I can't do it anymore, Sergeant. Last night's exercise, I froze up completely. Williams had to take over command when those simulated casualties started piling up. I couldn't think. Marcus nodded, remembering the previous evening's training. They'd run a complex scenario involving multiple wounded soldiers, equipment failures and communication breakdowns. Collins, who had been performing well as team leader, had indeed struggled when the pressure mounted. You know what I did the first time I had real casualties in my unit? Marcus asked. Collins shook his head. I threw up, right there in the middle of a firefight, with bullets flying over our heads and 2 of my soldiers bleeding out in the street. Marcus stared across the empty parking lot. My squad looked to me for leadership, and I was puking behind a concrete barrier because I couldn't handle the reality of what was happening. What did you do? I wiped my mouth, got back to work, and saved those soldiers' lives. Because that's what leaders do. They feel the fear, acknowledge it, and then do the job anyway. Marcus turned to face Collins directly. You didn't freeze last night. You experienced a normal human reaction to an overwhelming situation, and then you adapted by letting Williams step up when the team needed it. That's not failure, that's leadership. Collins was quiet for a long moment. It doesn't feel like leadership. It feels like I let everyone down. Collins, you're 23 years old and you've been tasked with leading soldiers into a competition evaluated by combat veterans. You're supposed to feel overwhelmed. The fact that you care this much about doing right by your team tells me you're exactly the kind of leader they need. Other soldiers began arriving for training, but Marcus and Collins remained on the steps. Marcus recognized this as a critical moment, not just for Collins, but for the entire team. If their designated leader lost confidence now, the effects would ripple through the entire unit. Tell me what you're really afraid of, Marcus said. Collins took a shaky breath. I'm afraid of failing them. These guys trust me to make the right decisions, and what if I can't? What if I get someone hurt because I'm not good enough? The honesty in the young soldier's voice reminded Marcus of his own fears before his first deployment, the sleepless nights wondering if he had what it took to bring his soldiers home alive. Collins, the leaders who worry about their soldiers are usually the ones who take the best care of them. It's the ones who never question themselves that you have to watch out for. Marcus stood and offered his hand to help Collins up. Come on. Your team is waiting for you, and they need to see that their leader doesn't quit when things get hard. Inside the armory, the atmosphere was tense. Word had spread about Collins's struggle, and the other soldiers watched nervously as he and Marcus entered together. William stepped forward, concern evident on his face. Collins, you good? He asked. Collins straightened his shoulders and met his teammates' eyes. I'm here. Let's get to work. Marcus had spent the previous night designing what he intended as their final training exercise before the competition, a comprehensive scenario that would test everything they'd learned over the past month. But seeing Collins's vulnerability, he realized the team needed something more than technical proficiency. Tonight's exercise is different, Marcus announced to the assembled soldiers. No predetermined scenarios, no scripted responses. You're going to face a situation where the only certainty is uncertainty, and you'll have to adapt as a team. He'd arranged with Jake to bring in soldiers from other units as role players. creating a scenario none of the trainees had seen before. As the lights dimmed and the exercise began, Marcus watched his students encounter challenges that required not just individual skill, but trust in each other. The scenario unfolded with brutal realism. Multiple casualty events, equipment failures, changing mission parameters, and time pressure that compressed decision-making into split-second choices. But this time, something was different. Collins, rather than trying to control every aspect of the situation, began delegating authority based on his teammates' strengths. When Williams showed superior tactical instincts during a room-clearing sequence, Collins stepped back and let him lead. When Rodriguez demonstrated better medical knowledge during casualty care, Collins supported his decisions rather than overriding them. Suppressing fire, left side, Collins called out during a particularly intense firefight sequence. But instead of micromanaging the response, he trusted his soldiers to execute properly. Williams, who had grown significantly in both skill and maturity over the month, provided steady fire support while maintaining clear communication with his team. Rodriguez, initially one of the quieter soldiers, stepped up as a natural medic, coordinating casualty evacuation with calm efficiency. As the exercise reached its climax, a scenario requiring the team to hold their position while evacuating wounded teammates under sustained fire, Marcus watched something remarkable happen. The soldiers stopped functioning as individuals following orders and began operating as a cohesive unit, anticipating each other's needs and covering each other's weaknesses without being told. When Marcus finally called end exercise, the silence that followed was different from previous training sessions. Instead of the exhausted frustration that had marked their earlier attempts, there was a sense of quiet confidence. Collins approached Marcus, his earlier self-doubt replaced by something steadier. "Sergeant Rivera, I want to thank you, not just for the tactical training, but for helping me understand what leadership actually looks like." Williams nodded in agreement. "A month ago, I thought leadership was about being the toughest guy in the room. Now I know it's about making everyone else better." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since before his deployment injuries, a sense that his own struggles had found purpose in helping these young soldiers discover their potential. "You did the work," he told them. "I just showed you what you were already capable of." Jake stepped forward, his expression mixing pride and amazement. "In 30 years of guard service, I've never seen a group come together like this. Marcus, I don't know how to thank you." Marcus looked around at the soldiers, no longer the uncertain, somewhat cocky young people he'd met a month ago, but a team that had learned to function under pressure while supporting each other through challenges that had seemed insurmountable. "The competition is tomorrow," he said. "You're ready. More than ready. Now go home, get some sleep, and tomorrow show those evaluators what the Montana National Guard is made of." As the soldiers filed out, chattering excitedly about the upcoming competition, Marcus remained behind to help Jake secure the equipment. The tremor in his hands had returned, but it felt different now, less like a symbol of his brokenness and more like a reminder of battles fought and survived. "Marcus," Jake said as they locked up the weapons storage, "what are your plans after tomorrow?" It was a question Marcus had been avoiding. Tomorrow's competition represented an ending, the completion of the commitment he'd made to help prepare these soldiers. After that, he'd presumably return to his quiet nights at the mall, his empty apartment, his careful management of memories and trauma. But looking around the armory one last time, Marcus realized something had changed. Not just for the soldiers he'd trained, but for himself. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but for the first time in 7 years, I'm looking forward to finding out." The Montana National Guard training facility at Fort Harrison was buzzing with activity at 600 hours. Buses from Guard units across the state had arrived throughout the night, bringing teams of soldiers who would compete in what had become the most challenging marksmanship and tactical competition in the region's history. Marcus stood beside Jake's Humvee, watching his soldiers unload their equipment with the methodical precision he'd drilled into them over the past month. The early morning air was crisp, their breath visible in small clouds, and the first hints of sunrise painted the eastern sky a pale orange. "Nervous?" Jake asked, noting how Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he checked his watch. "For them, yeah," Marcus admitted. "They've worked hard. They deserve to succeed." Across the staging area, Marcus could see the other competing teams. Most were comprised of younger soldiers, but several units had brought experienced NCOs and even a few active duty personnel on temporary assignment. The competition was clearly being taken seriously by units fighting to prove their continued relevance in an era of budget cuts. Collins approached, wearing full battle gear and carrying his M4 with the comfortable familiarity that had developed over weeks of intensive training. "Sergeant Rivera, the other teams have been asking about you." "What do you mean?" "Word got around about your background. Some of the other team leaders are wondering if it's fair for us to have someone with 3 combat tours as an advisor." Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. "Collins, I won't be out there with you. This is your competition." "I know that, Sergeant. And I told them that everything we've learned, we earned through our own work. You just showed us what we were capable of." A loudspeaker crackled to life across the facility. "All competing teams report to the briefing area. Competition begins in 30 minutes. As they walked toward the main building, Marcus noticed several soldiers from other units staring at his group. His students moved with a confidence and cohesion that set them apart, not arrogant, but quietly assured of their capabilities. The briefing room held about 80 soldiers representing 12 guard units from across Montana. At the front of the room stood 3 evaluators, a Special Forces Master Sergeant, a Marine Corps Gunnery Sergeant, and a retired Army Colonel who now worked as a training consultant. The Master Sergeant, his uniform bearing the distinctive Special Forces tab and multiple combat patches, addressed the assembled competitors. "Gentlemen, today's competition consists of 3 phases. Phase 1, individual marksmanship at distances from 100 to 500 meters, with points awarded for accuracy and time. Phase 2, small unit tactics involving room clearing, casualty evacuation, and defensive operations. Phase 3, a comprehensive scenario that will test your ability to function as a cohesive unit under sustained pressure." Marcus felt his chest tighten as the evaluator continued outlining scenarios that seemed designed to break down unit cohesion and individual confidence. This wasn't just a competition. It was a trial by fire conducted by men who had seen real combat and would accept nothing less than excellence. Your performance will be evaluated not just on technical proficiency, but on leadership, adaptability, and your ability to support your teammates when everything starts going wrong. The Master Sergeant's eyes swept the room. Because in real combat, everything always goes wrong. Phase 1 took place on the facility's precision rifle range, with targets set at varying distances, and each competitor allowed only 1 shot per target. Marcus watched from the observation area as his students took their turns, his own anxiety mounting with each shot. Collins went first, settling into his firing position with the fluid movements Marcus had drilled into him. The first target at 100 meters, a clean hit in the 9 ring. The 200-meter target, dead center. By the time Collins finished his string of 5 shots, he'd scored 47 out of a possible 50 points, placing him 3rd among all competitors. Williams followed with a performance that surprised even Marcus. The young soldier who had started as the team's weakest marksman scored 45 points, demonstrating the steady improvement that came from dedicated practice and proper instruction. Rodriguez and Martinez both shot respectably, and when the individual scores were tallied, Marcus's team ranked 2nd overall heading into the tactical phases. But Phase 2 would test more than just shooting skills. The small unit tactics course was a maze of buildings, obstacles, and hidden targets that required teams to clear rooms, treat casualties, and coordinate complex movements while under time pressure. Marcus watched from the evaluation tower as his students entered the course, Collins leading with Williams providing overwatch. The first room presented a hostage scenario, multiple targets with 1 designated friendly. Collins approached the doorway with the careful deliberation Marcus had taught him, taking the extra seconds needed to properly identify threats. "Hostage secured," Collins called out as his team moved through the room with textbook precision. The next challenge involved a simulated casualty evacuation under fire. Rodriguez, who had emerged as the team's natural medic, coordinated the evacuation while Williams and Martinez provided covering fire. Their movements were smooth, practiced, coordinated, the result of dozens of repetitions under stressful conditions. As they approached the final challenge, a defensive scenario requiring the team to hold a position against multiple attackers, Marcus felt his hands stop trembling. These soldiers no longer needed his guidance. They had internalized everything he'd taught them and made it their own. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, with simulated enemy forces using sound effects and blank ammunition to create realistic combat stress. But instead of the confusion and breakdown Marcus had witnessed in their early training, his soldiers responded with calm efficiency. Collins coordinated fields of fire, Williams adjusted positions based on changing threats, and Rodriguez maintained ammunition supply while treating simulated casualties. They functioned as a unit, each soldier understanding his role within the larger team structure. When the exercise concluded, the evaluating Master Sergeant approached Marcus in the observation area. "Your students?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant." "Outstanding performance. Clean, professional, coordinated." The evaluator studied Marcus with experienced eyes. "3 tours in Iraq?" "Yes, Sergeant." "It shows. Your soldiers move like they understand what this training is actually for." The Master Sergeant paused. "You interested in a consulting position? We're always looking for instructors with real-world experience." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, not just pride in his students' performance, but the possibility of a future he hadn't considered. I'd be interested in discussing that." Phase 3 began as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the training area. The final scenario was designed to test everything the teams had learned, a complex mission involving multiple objectives, changing conditions, and sustained pressure over a 90-minute period. Marcus watched from the sidelines as his students faced their ultimate test, no longer as their instructor, but as an observer witnessing the culmination of their month-long journey from uncertain individuals to a cohesive military unit. Collins led his team through the scenario with quiet confidence, adapting to each new challenge while maintaining focus on the overall mission. Williams had evolved into a natural tactical leader, positioning his soldiers and coordinating fire support with instinctive skill. Rodriguez and Martinez supported their teammates with the kind of trust that could only develop through shared adversity and mutual respect. When the final whistle sounded, ending the competition, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. Not just of the training program, but of something deeper, a healing that had occurred not through forgetting his past, but through finding a way to use his experience to help others. The award ceremony took place that evening, with all competing teams assembled in the facility's main auditorium. Marcus sat in the audience wearing civilian clothes as the results were announced. 3rd place in overall competition, Bozeman National Guard Unit 456. Applause filled the room. 2nd place, Great Falls National Guard Unit 341. More applause, louder now. 1st place with outstanding scores in all 3 phases and a demonstration of military proficiency that sets the standard for Guard units statewide. Billings National Guard Unit 163, led by Specialist Collins. The applause was thunderous as Marcus's students took the stage. Collins accepted the trophy with the poise of a natural leader. Williams stood at attention with quiet pride, and Rodriguez and Martinez beamed with the satisfaction of hard work rewarded. But what moved Marcus most was when Collins stepped to the microphone. "This award belongs to our entire unit, but especially to someone who showed us what we were capable of becoming. Sergeant Marcus Rivera taught us that leadership isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about making everyone else stronger. Thank you, Sergeant." As the crowd erupted in applause, Marcus felt tears in his eyes for the first time since coming home from Iraq. Not tears of pain or loss, but of something he had almost forgotten was possible. Pride, purpose, and the knowledge that his experience, all of it, even the darkest parts, had found meaning in helping these young soldiers discover their potential. Jake found him after the ceremony. "Marcus, that job offer from the evaluator, are you going to take it?" Marcus looked across the room at his students, now surrounded by congratulatory soldiers from other units, their faces bright with accomplishment and confidence. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." Outside the facility, the Montana sky was clear and filled with stars. As Marcus walked to his truck, he realized that for the first time in 7 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The nightmares might still come, his hands might still shake, and the memories of Iraq would never completely fade. But tonight, he had discovered something he thought he'd lost forever, the knowledge that his service, his sacrifice, and even his struggles had purpose. He was no longer just a broken veteran working security at an empty mall. He was Sergeant Marcus Rivera, and he had work to do.